welcome our fourth and final panel of the day. Up to the front, please. And Professor Praneeta Mudaliar will be our moderator. Actually, why don't you all introduce yourselves? Do you mind, as Praneeta takes the stage, and say who you are, what your affiliations are? Oh, please. Why don't we start with Imara?
Sure. Okay.
Hi,
everybody. My name is Imara Rolston. I'm an assistant professor at the Dalla School of Public Health. That's my nightlife. My day life is as a policymaker at the City of Toronto. And so my work is focused on a project called Reconciling Racial Justice and Climate Resilience. I'm leading that project with a bunch of really great community actors and across from other schools. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you all about that work so far.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca McMillan. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and Planning. Here today with Joanna Kostis, we're on a shared project with the Urban Challenges Grant on building policymakers' capacities to address climate change in Southeast Asian cities. And my own work is on community-based water management in the Latin American context, primarily in Venezuela.
And I'm Joanna, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of the UK, and I'm just going to let you get started so we can go.
Hi, everyone. My name is Praneeta Mudaliar. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in Mississauga with research interests and background in environmental justice, climate justice, and the topic for our panel is something that is very close to my heart, is on climate justice. So we're going to get started, and first, we have assistant professor Fikile Nxumalo, who's going to be giving us pre-recorded remarks, and she'll be addressing the overarching question for our panel. What are the best practices with respect to building local capacity to empower communities to pursue climate justice?
I'll offer some insights from my recent project, which spoke to Black parents with young children in schools in the Greater Toronto Area. The first insight is that there's a need to find ways to engage in conversations that begin from the relationships that Black communities have with particular urban places. What this means is that it's important to consider how conversations about climate begin from the in-place desires, relations, and reparative actions of Black communities, rather than structuring conversations predominantly through damage, loss, and lack. For instance, in my work, I found that beginning with the stance that there are already Black ecological relationships in places like Toronto meant that I created intentional invitations for stories with potential for disrupting erasures and deficit framings of Black Canadian ecological relationships and knowledges. Such Black ecological filled with possibilities for expanding what counts as climate justice education, such that it centers and affirms Black relations with lands and waters that are past, present, and desired future relationships. Importantly, beginning with affirmative relations does not mean that there is not an opening to discussions of challenges. For instance, the Black families I spoke to discussed the ways in which they saw the compounded effects of racialization, immigrant newcomer status, and income level contributing to climate-related precarity in the city and more broadly in Canada. They also discussed their insights on disproportionate impacts of environmental precarity on Indigenous communities in Canada. The second insight that connects to the previous point on affirmative stories is that the Black parents I spoke to had important insights on their desires for their children's environmental and climate education. Importantly, their responses indicated a desire for educational approaches that took an interdisciplinary, multifaceted approach, for instance, a dominant focus on Western science and learning about climate change. For instance, their desires for climate justice education brought up possibilities, including addressing Ontario's curricular erasures of long histories of Black communities in Canada, which involved them providing particular examples of experiences of and resistance to environmental racism of Black communities, such as Africville. They also spoke of their desires for their children to learn about the effects of extractivism on nature, for their young children to be taught advocacy or activism in relation to the environment, to be taught in ways that brought forward Indigenous knowledges in environmental education, and for curriculum to include food justice as an important area of concern related to climate. They also pointed to possibilities not only in formal school curriculum, but in the out-of-school programs that they were accessing. The third insight is that there needs to be ways to recognize and support the place-based learning that Black families engage in with their children. Some families discuss the importance of time spent in the outdoors, and particularly how important this was during the height of the pandemic. The outdoors were also described in multiple ways, including as a time to engage in learning with their children. However, this appreciation of time outdoors was juxtaposed with inequities. Several conversations centered on supporting access to green spaces. While there was an acknowledgement that Toronto has many places to engage with lands and waters, families also discussed how many places were difficult to access for communities. They particularly noted Black and other predominantly communities of color that lived in high rises and had a lack of easily accessible green spaces. In addition to issues of access, families also shared experiences that left them feeling unwelcome in certain outdoor and recreational spaces, including experiences with racism in Toronto, and noticing that particular places close to them were not cared for or felt unsafe. In closing, these conversations provided important insights on Black ecological relationships in Toronto, the desires of Black families for their children's environmental education, as well as the important systemic barriers that remain both in formal environmental education and in relation to possibilities for Black families to further nurture these ecological relationships with their children.
All right, so next up we have Dr. Joanna Koshish and Rebecca McMillan. So you'll have a particularly hard task of dividing 5 minutes between themselves for their remarks.
Thank you. As Leaf mentioned, actually, in this morning's panel on data, we know a lot about how climate change affects people in marginalized communities, and really now it's time to act. And so our project took a somewhat different approach to this task of building the capacity to deal with urban climate injustice. So after working with a group of academics and policy members and civil society actors in the Urban Climate Resilience in Southeast Asia Partnership, which was a big project that Rebecca and I worked on. We worked with them for over 5 years. We started to recognize that no matter how strong the voices of community members or the capacities of civil society actors or how rigorous research of academics, all of the important information that we learned about climate resilience made little impact if policymakers didn't understand it and know how to apply it in their work. And so our project works at this interface between knowledge and action. And we really sought to build what we call receptive capacity, policymakers in Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia. So we consider the role of researchers as knowledge brokers between often disconnected groups, like policymakers and community members who don't necessarily talk to each other very often. We consider this to be a really essential role for researchers, and we recognize that often funders, not the school cities because they're fantastic, consider that once research is conducted and reports are written, their responsibility is over. And we disagree. So we sought to develop new ways to bridge this knowledge to policy gap. And specifically, we were trying to enhance the ability of policymakers who are mostly trained in Southeast Asia. In our context, we're mostly trained as engineers, and not engineers that took Maya's course in inclusive infrastructure most of the time, to understand and apply knowledge about the social factors that impact climate justice and how to apply those to policies that affect people's lives. So first, we interviewed policymakers to understand better their knowledge needs, and then we designed an interactive based workshop to help them learn the basics of political ecology and social justice, climate change basics, as well as some key collective problem solving tools. And then we interviewed them again after we piloted the workshop with them to see how it went and how we needed to adapt the workshop to each of the specific political and economic contexts.
Great.
Thanks, Joanna.
Thanks, Joanna. I'm just going to briefly comment on 3 kind of key findings or ideas that we're working with that came out of this project. And I just want to reiterate that we're also working with a really awesome team, particularly 2 researchers in Thailand and Cambodia, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. So I just want to talk about 3 kind of topics. So one is how we frame climate change as a problem. One is how we work together in solutions to climate change. And thirdly, how we finance these types of solutions. And so as Joanna already mentioned, when we're doing this kind of collaborative research, actors come with very different understandings of the climate change problem. And in particular, our research partners in Southeast Asia often associate climate change with just being an environmental problem, just one of climate change emissions. Where they do focus on adaptation, it's really not always well-grounded in these concerns of climate justice that we're discussing today. It's often focused on kind of technical or engineering approaches to adaptation, protecting the existing patterns of development rather than recognizing that, development in these cities really doesn't work well for many residents, particularly urban informal dwellers that we heard about this morning. So that key insight's really about, in any kind of collaborative work, we really need to recognize these different, it's not just about kind of access to knowledge or even access to data, it's really about different values and recognizing them and working at that kind of empathetic value level. So the second thing I just want to mention quickly is how we find solutions. We're really emphasizing building relationships. The most exciting kind of best practices that we've seen in these communities is where actors who don't normally collaborate come together. So one case was urban flooding, where essentially the flood issue was shared by multiple municipalities on the same watershed, but essentially through the flood control infrastructure, they were just passing the flood problem onto each other. And so they came together and have this flood cluster to kind of collectively manage the flood problem. And in this, we're really working with the idea of researchers as potentially brokers, because particularly in the context where we're working, the governance is very hierarchical, it's very siloed. And so researchers can kind of navigate these hierarchies in a way that the policymakers can't. And then the third thing I want to emphasize, so Joanna already mentioned it, School of Cities really gets this, but that a lot of the ways that researchers kind of get funding in the program design, as well as development program design, doesn't really add the time or the financing for building this receptive capacity, which is a really long process. And the other thing I want to drive home is that the financing for adaptation is rooted in the megacities. So we're working with these smaller cities, and it's kind of a vicious cycle where they don't necessarily have the capacity, but because they don't have the capacity, they don't get the financing. It goes to Bangkok rather than Khon Kaen, for example.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Next up, we have Dr. Imara Rolston.
Yeah, great. So as I said before, our project is called the Reconciling Racial Justice and Climate Resilience Project. It's a bit of a funny pairing, partly because if you understand the histories of African and Caribbean Black communities, asking folks to be resilient can be quite problematic, considering the amount of resilience that we've had to put out to face different histories of disenfranchisement. Our project is a partnership that brings together Center for Connected Communities, the Network for Advancement of Black Communities, and Metropolitan University. And in particular, we're interested in addressing what we call the racial spatial climate divide in this city. And when we talk about the racial spatial climate divide, typically when I talk about it, I have a slide with a bunch of maps that show you the city. One of those slides represents the work that a lot of us know about, David Hochansky's work about the tale of 2 cities and 3 cities, and the way our city is becoming a more unequal city. And so you have complete affluence in the center of the city, and you have intense dispossession, economic dispossession in the outer suburbs. The other map I like to show is work done by the Wellesley Institute, which shows the concentration of eviction rates in the city. It maps on top of the areas that are considered lower income. The other map that I like to show is how the areas in the city that the City of Toronto has identified as neighborhood improvement areas, areas that have a history of being underserved by the city itself. The reason why we call this the racial spatial climate divide is that if you take all those maps and put them on top of each other, the concentrations of dispossession show up in the same place in the city. If you take the concentration of Black folks in the city and put it on top of that, everything lays on top of each other. And so we have a fast-moving crisis on our hands, and our project is about getting ahead of that. The way we're trying to do that is by talking to 105 key informants across 7 cities in North America. And we're talking to folks in cities that have a long history of structural racial injustice. And we're talking to folks everywhere from academics to policymakers to grassroots actors. And the year for us has been to take that wisdom, to take that experience, and draw that back into a process here where we create a racial justice climate resilience framework for Toronto. Now, one of the things that we want to do through this process and what we intend to do through this process is bring together policymakers, grassroots actors, and activists into the same room to co-construct the framework, because we don't want this to be a framework that sits on the shelf. The other thing I want to make sure this framework is that it's something that lives in the life of people over a long-term period of time. I had a long history of working with a bunch of different organizations like Oxfam and Greenpeace and other organizations like that. And what you often find is that funding is spread a mile wide and an inch deep. It's focused on many places, but not a lot of money. We want the framework to focus on one neighborhood, and we want to work with not-for-profits, grassroots actors, policymakers, focused neighborhood over a very long period of time to bring this framework to life. And so that's what our project is really about. And we've been talking to folks in Boston, in Oakland, in Miami, in New York. And a part of what I'm going to be sharing with you all today, because I'll just keep it short because I know we don't have a lot of time, is some of the insights that have been coming from that research thus far.
Thanks, Dr. Ross. So I have a bunch of questions based on what you all said and also connecting it to Dr. Ageman's talk. So one question is, so Dr. Ageman laid out this, and this is at the risk of going off script. So give us this, what we need to be doing, right, in order to foster belonging. And I would argue that in order to foster belonging, there also needs to be some degree of care to foreground belonging, right? So one question is, so how could other partners, so this is policymakers, academics, private sector folks, how could they work with communities, especially when this demographic shift is coming? There are new people coming in who really can't even vote, right? Refugee immigrants don't have the capacity to vote. So how do you get people in power to actually care in order to work with these communities and then have some degree of belonging and then becoming with the city?
Yeah, I'd like to answer that. I think one of the great things about starting with a focus on racial justice is that it changes the locus of the conversation. And so when we talk about racial justice, we talk about communities from an asset-based standpoint, in particular African and Caribbean communities from an asset-based standpoint. And so what we're talking about is communities that are powerful and resilient, that have been facing long histories of systemic, structural, and institutional disenfranchisement. Now, when we start the question there, that means that the way I think communities and people come to belong in processes and decision-making need to go beyond what we consider the typical and acceptable fashion of engagement with communities. And so what I like, and when I think about some of the best practices that we're seeing here in the city and other places, are moments when cities in particular, and as a policymaker, I think about this, policymakers start to sort of push aside this idea of advisory being the sort of panacea, advisory tables being the panacea for inclusion, belonging, and more robust engagement in policymaking and decision-making, and start to move to sort of the grittier, harder, more challenging idea of accountability, and actually creating accountability structures that make it harder for you to do your work, but make it, I think, easier and better for communities because they have more say, they have more control. And I think in many ways, being able to self-define, being able to recreate your neighborhoods in the way that you see fit, being able to control processes and decisions that affect your life is one of the most important ingredients of belonging. And accountability mechanisms are some of the most important tools. We can see this in places like the City of Toronto. The Indigenous Affairs Office has said no to an advisory group and is focused on accountability. The Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit said no to an advisory group and has focused on an accountability circle that writes to council about the progress of the unit itself. The unit cannot edit that. So if the unit's not doing its job, then everybody knows. And I think that's the future of belonging in this city. And I think that's particularly important for climate justice, because the levels of insecurity and stability that we're going to see are going to require greater levels of accountability technology when it comes to the relational, the relationship between communities and governance spaces.
Ooh, I love that. Relations. Yes, of course. Go ahead.
So I'll answer on that. I think Professor Agyeman was talking about the importance of contact for creating compassion. And in the cases that we work in, there often isn't very much contact between the policymakers we work with and the communities that we're concerned about. And so the approach that we took, I'd mentioned that we sort of use this interactive games-based workshop, is purposefully what Anna Hickey-Moody calls effective pedagogies based. So how experiencing sort of art and performance and fun can change how you feel and how that changes what you know. And so one of the concerns that we had working with policymakers is this structure of expertise and authority that's very, very important when you're dealing with academics or policymakers or authorities of any sort of ilk. And in Southeast Asia, the hierarchy is very significant and strong. And so the idea of using we call them applied learning simulations, which is essentially a role-playing game where people like the Minister of the Environment has to take on the role of the lead of the women's union or the lead of a local village, allows an opportunity to build that sort of compassion through synthetic contact in a way that is playful and not challenging the direct authority through challenging the expertise of a policymaker. So, for example, if we as academics feel, my value from knowing everything there is to know about just sustainabilities, and then somebody challenges us and says, well, what about this? All of a sudden, our authority feels shaken. And so we take the same approach with policymakers and suggest, no, we're not suggesting that you don't know what you need to know. We just want you to play this game with us, and possibly you'll learn some new stuff along the way. And so in terms of building compassion through contact where it's not feasible or maybe not even safe in our case to create that actual contact, we're trying to create proxies for it.
Thanks, Joanna. Rebecca?
The only thing I'll add to that is that built into the structure of the game are some of the findings from our researchers on, vulnerability of different groups. So when the, policymaker is playing the landless farmer, we've, given them a sheet with some of the, and many of them have reflected, I never thought about it from this angle. Another concept, the idea of gendered vulnerability was something that's very new to the policymaker. So we try to, put the information in there, but in a way that's sort of interactive and not, us teaching it to them in a more direct way.
Great. Thank you. We have a question from the audience, and I can't for the life read this word, but maybe it is. So how do you pitch, and this is, I think, in reference to all of your projects, how do you pitch that to a municipality who needs to invest in adaptation when traditionally they expect return on investment, but adaptation is preventing cost? I hope I read that
How do
right.
you justify the cost of this kind of social adaptation? Question, maybe?
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in our case, it's costing the municipalities a lot of money to deal with poverty. Some municipalities aren't actively dealing with it as much as others, but ultimately having to relocate communities or having to address climate crises, disaster resilience efforts are costing a lot more than it would cost to allow people to have access to resources or to allow people to have rights or to allow people to be represented in certain municipal forums. And so I think it's not so much about showing the cost benefit analysis, which is important, but making people understand that marginalization is costing the city money as well.
Though I do think it is useful, and this came on our researchers with the policymakers, to foreground the fact that often prevention is, less costly than adapting down the road. And that's something that many of the policymakers are already seeing in the city. So, for example, one of the case study cities, the government invested in, new highways and shopping centers. And, they had received some warnings that there were going to be flood issues associated with those developments because of the way, all this concrete undermines, the permeable surfaces, and they weren't listened to. And then indeed the flooding did happen. So, and it is costing a lot of money. So I think that is something that is effective in engaging with policymakers to stress that, value of prevention.
Yeah, I would almost shift the conversation a bit away from. I think it's a really good question, but away from pitching to the idea of openings and opportunities. I think in policy making cycles, there are openings and opportunities, where there are moments where policymakers divisions are more receptive to particular ideas. And I think one of our international panelists talked about anyways, I can't remember, but the reason why I think that's important is because talked about the way divisions are often siloed in cities. And so while you may not be able to advance an idea or a particular initiative through a particular policy trajectory or pathway, say for instance, in social development, finance and administration, children's services, climate, economic development, and culture, there is a span. And if you use an opportunity and an opening with one division and one team to leverage a relationship with another, then it's not about pitching, it's about the openings and opportunities. And you can kind of bricolage your way to something more intensive and robust. And I think that's the work of politics within the city and making policy and changing policy, that it is about opportunities and openings. And that outweighs the fiscal realities that we face. That's just a thought, and I'm sure there's a bunch of policymakers who are just going to tell me you're completely off the map or be quiet, but that's my experience.
I have a bunch of follow-ups for that. Like, policymakers, maybe, I don't work with policymakers, I study policymaking, but maybe they do understand all of y'all the things that y'all mentioned, but it's really hard to change laws, right? Like zoning laws, for example. And, in the previous panel, Professor Mark Johnson did a mini therapy session on Mississauga. Living there is hard. All the spatial injustices that you mentioned in your talk, like Mississauga can be a case study held up as a shining ad example of that, but there's no housing there. And zoning laws, just recently, I think 2 weeks ago or something, affordable housing units were proposed, but that was knocked off. So what does it really take to change these zoning laws? And policymakers who understand this are working within the structure and constraints of policy and laws, which are really hard to change. And this again goes back to that question of the demographics of Mississauga are so different, but the policymakers are all white and all dynasty, councillors. How do we move away from that then? And this might be a really broad and hard question, but I live in Mississauga, and for me, Mark Johnson's therapy session was really, really important.
I can just say in the UCRC project, the project I referenced before, we focused on 4 pillars, which were knowledge, skills, access between community and policymakers, and political will. And we really understood that changing political will is not something that academics are going to do with evidence-based studies, and that often the change in political will comes from academics supporting or later sort of joining on with civil society when there are these sort of windows of opportunity to take evidence that we've had. I think I can't remember who it was this morning, said climate scientists have known this was a problem for a very long time. Grasping those windows of opportunity to bring things to light when there's a politically opportune moment. Unfortunately, I think that academics tend to work alone a lot of the time, and we tend to speak to each other a lot of the time. And the way we speak to each other is not particularly accessible to civil society, for example. And so I think that's one of the things that we were trying to do, was to find a way to bridge the gap between academic knowledge and both community and policymakers.
I love that. I think a lot of it is about cross-disciplinary coalitions. I think academics need to find new ways to have strong relationships with really challenging, strong community activists and actors. I think insurgent civil servants inside cities need to find ways to align with that work. I think when you build those sort of cross collaborations, then it means you get to do what may seem kind of underhanded, but work all angles and all opportunities across. And then when the opportunity presents itself to sort of move something forward, Then you have folks speaking from an academic space, you have folks speaking from an activist space, and you have insurgent civil servants who are helping map out the pathways towards progress for a particular policy change. And I think one of the important things that we always have to recognize is that across the board, it means that we expand our capacity to work in more insurgent ways. That means academics, that means policymakers, and we need to find our people. And it is a long game, but I've seen it happen. Just perfect example. There were folks agitating. Julian was talking about food and food justice. There were folks in the Black community in the city that were agitating for Black food sovereignty for a long time. There were policymakers who were thinking about Black food sovereignty for a long time. COVID-19 hit, the uprising started, and people panicked. And all of a sudden, there was an opening for Black food sovereignty where there wasn't. But that coalition of collaborators, academics, activists, and policymakers were able to move through a strategy where they've been able to before. But that meant relationship building for years. And we need to be poised for those opportunities to open up. And so again, coalitions, collaborations, and insurgents, I think, are the kind of things we need to embrace to make those things happen. And that bears out in the research.
Thanks, Imara. So one more audience question. Much of the work specifically focuses on climate resilience. How does your work interface with broader resilience to other stressors and shocks? Is it difficult to draw that line?
I guess I can speak to that briefly. If I understand the question correctly, I think in our work, we understand that the climate change issue is just one of the change processes that is affecting these cities. In particular, the secondary cities where we're working are rapidly urbanizing due to a process of regional integration. And so there's, development of special economic zones, factories, which are, often dispossessing people of land, contaminating water. So we're really looking at the sort of interaction of those issues. In our case, climate change is a use entry point sometimes for getting at those other issues, which can be a little bit more controversial, I think.
I would, as a part of our research, we had to sort of take a broad look at all of the sort of North American-based conversations about resilience, particularly from a policy standpoint. And one way to do that, not the only way, but one way to do that is to the sort of resilient strategies that were created through the Rockefeller Foundation's funding across. And what you see, particularly when you look at the more progressive strategies, are that the conversations about resilience are mentioning everything from food to mobility to schooling, and what it means and what it's telling you. And I'm gonna plug Julian for this because Julian had said this before. It reminds us that climate change, and you said this, is a symptom. There is a broader base of disenfranchisement that creates the climate and disproportionate climate vulnerability, the racial spatial climate divide. And so the resilience that we're talking about has to be completely holistic, completely diverse, and has to pull in issues that communities have been addressing and speaking about: community safety and well-being, gentrification, food justice. All of those are climate issues. All of those are climate resilience issues, and all those are pillars to advance a just climate resilient city. So I think they are all connected. And I don't think we have to pull them apart. In fact, we should be weaving them together in more intensive ways.
And if I can just add, I think that was one of the really great things that came out of the 100 Resilience was this idea of like a climate change officer, which in our context is sort of way like eons away. When we do bring policymakers together for these workshops, one of the biggest comments we get right afterwards was, and these are people who work in the same city, I've never met these people before. Oh my goodness, you should bring us together more often. I didn't know these people also had something to do, whatever. And so they're really excited to meet people, say, from public health or from infrastructure or from agriculture. And the fact that they've never interacted and that they enjoy the interactions and find a lot of value in it shows that this idea of bringing people together for a holistic approach, because these are not siloed problems, the solutions are not going to be found in silos. They're here for it. They want to do it. It's just, are we available to resource it? And what's being threatened, I guess, by us bringing these people together? And that's the big question. And I think there is something being threatened because not many people really want to do it. And it seems to be a struggle. And in 100 Resilient Cities, when they brought together these climate change offices, as soon as the project ended, a lot of them moved. So if we know that this is effective, what are we threatening by trying to do it? And I think that's where we get to this idea of political will.
Mm-hmm. And I also just want to add the point, in addition to kind of connecting these different silos, I think we also, we're talking about cities here, but a lot of the processes that are, shaping urban resilience or contributing to urban climate change impacts go beyond the city scale. And I think so something that the climate justice movement has brought to light, in the Latin American context where we also work, a lot of the climate justice activism is thinking about sort of the post-extractive future. So linking, the struggles around, mining with things like basic needs in the city. So I think that's also rethinking the scale of urbans.
Thanks, Rebecca. This is a really important question, but we're going to make it quick because I do want to move on to the international discussant. But the question is, how has the Black Lives Matter movement provided leadership on climate justice issues and the city? And all of you all mentioned silos at some point. So I think this is a really important one. And how do these different movements intersect and move them?
Yeah, I would say so. I would love to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement within the context, if we're talking about Toronto, of long legacies of racial justice organizing. It brings to mind, the Black Action Defense Committee here in the 80s and 90s. That brings to mind organizations like Black CAP and what we call Black Serving, Black-led, Black-focused organizations that have been doing amazing work for a long time. So I kind of want to give props and recognize all those organizations. But what I think Black organizing and Black activism has brought to the table is a sort of a necessary radicalism in the way we think about climate justice and climate change. And so the classic example that I gave was pushing the conversation beyond food security toward food safety, pushing the conversation from food deserts to food apartheid. And what does that mean for policymaking? Pushing the conversation from a seat at the table through an advisory table to an accountability circle. I think a lot of what Black communities and the BLM have organized for are sort of essential pillars for a climate resilient future. If we're thinking about what we're going to face over the next 15 years, it is undoubtedly increased instability and increased security. And so this idea that you have young people putting their lives on the line to talk about transforming radically the way we think about safety and well-being in the city is a gift to everybody. When you have young people putting their lives on the line, talking about the way things have historically failed Black folks and this city, it is a gift to us for the next 15 to 30 years. So I think, again, one of the things that BLM offers and Black organizing offers, because of the depth of disenfranchisement that oftentimes African, Caribbean, and Black communities have faced in this city and others, is a more radical vision for how the city can change, but it's a more protective vision for how the city in the future if we follow that kind of leadership. And that's across the board, across a number of issues.
Thank you so much, Imara. That's the exact argument that Professor Nicole Hannah-Jones makes in her book, 1619, that the contribution of Black people to making lives better for everyone has just been completely undervalued and erased. Next up, we'll move on to our international Assistant Professor Linda Shi joins us from the Department of City and Regional Planning from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, a place very close to my heart. So, Linda?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's nice to join with you. I wish I were there in person, and I feel like this disembodied voice that's kind of an international alien landing in Toronto space. So listening to all of you from afar, I am struck by some of the connections and also disconnections in what I'm hearing. And just listening to Imara and Fikile and how they're talking about racial justice as the key component of climate justice, the language around sovereignty, apartheid, racism are fundamentally different language and words that Joanna and Rebecca are using to describe other similar kinds of issues in a very different context. And so I find myself reflecting on, are we having the same conversation? Do we need to be having the same conversation? How does climate justice manifest in these different ways? And do we need to have it in the same kinds of language or not? Because they are actually so very distinct. And so in some ways, I think it is very contextual. It doesn't need to be that it shouldn't be that we are using the same language to talk about these issues in different places. At the same time, I do think that there is so much power to the words that we use and the discourse around Black Lives Matters, around racial justice as the basic premise of climate justice. Coming from a primarily global north environment has incredible power in shaping the discourse around the world, and that kind of framing is imposed across the diversity of contexts within even the global north, as well as across global north and global south. And so we don't see necessarily the same kind of power of language and imaging and discourse that is shaping this in the other direction, for instance. As an Asian American woman, I'm also struck by the very focused ways in which we have a very black and white set of conversations, and sometimes in indigenous and white conversations, but the conversations are not usually indigenous and black, or Hispanic and Asian and black and white. It is a very focused one, and there are very important reasons why that is. But I think that also shapes the kinds of receptiveness or the kinds of depths of issues that we can actually engage in. So, for instance, I have a PhD student, Shanasia Silman, who's doing really interesting thinking around what does land back and reparations have to learn from each other, and the scales at which we think about this. We are talking about individual payments to specific individual people and families, whereas we're talking about land back to tribal communities and whole entities. Does that matter? How does the kind of land takings, land claims across these different groups and the histories of maroon communities, that are tied in together. So there are lots of opportunities, even within our countries, to think about how to divide, or not divide, but to change the conversation that we are having in different kinds of specific words. And then if there is a need for us to have the same language, I would think that it has to do with international mobilization and movement building across these different geographies. And in those circumstances, what is the kind of language around climate justice that we are really talking about? Because in some places it will be ethnic or religious or caste, and other kinds of differences, or rural urban in China is a hukou based status. The chimes are chiming. I think it's whatever. It's almost 3:30, so I don't know if you can hear that on your end. So I do think that there are opportunities to break open these conversations so that they actually can speak to people as they actually exist in terms of policymakers on the ground. Another set of disconnects or connections that I'm hearing people talk about is how climate informs other existing movements on the ground. And I always think about this quote from Naomi Klein in her book, This Changes Everything, where she says, so climate change does not need some shiny new movement that will succeed where others failed. Rather, as the furthest reaching crisis created by the extractivist worldview, and one that puts humanity on a firm and unyielding deadline, climate change can be the force, the grand push, that will bring together all of these still living movements. So when I think of this comment, and in the work that I am doing right now on climate migration, when you have conversations, it repeatedly, it just comes back to climate change is going to, as I think others have said on this panel, it just highlights and emphasizes all the weaknesses and problems that are existing today. And that means rather than attending to climate as a new dilemma, we are really fundamentally talking about housing. Above all, we are chiefly talking about the availability, affordability, and siting of housing, in addition to job availability, infrastructure, water, health, food, and other things. And so I think that there is a need for us to consider, as people move working in the climate space, how we are contributing ourselves to the movements of these already existing movements, decadal movements around housing or food or access and other things. And I think that still we see these divisions where climate actors, and I say that as somebody doing something very similar, are trying to find other people to pull them into our gravity center. But we have an opportunity to also bring ourselves to those existing movements and bring those together. And then lastly, I think I have a conversation around the social infrastructure that we need in order to advance this as a process. And so there's a conversation here between how much of what we're talking about is really choice and how much of it is structure. And so there is a huge amount of um, So I'll give an example. I did a study that looked at, there's all these debates around, should we use adaptation? Should we use the word resilience? How do we speak about equity and how do communities think about it? So I pulled a sample of, I think, like almost a dozen uh, documents that were developed largely by organizations and social movement organizations in the United States or in North America that were talking about equitable adaptation, or equitable resilience, or transformative resilience and adaptation. And I wanted to see what kinds of words they were using and how they were thinking about it. So when you code through all of the diverse strategies that they suggested we put forward to achieve these kinds of things, and in the end, the language didn't matter so much as the things that they were talking about, you get three basic chunks, I would say. One is around procedural and changes to procedural change. So how do we get power? How do we get a seat at the table? How do we educate people so that they are actually able to speak to these issues and have the conversation when they are brought to the table? How do we bring these voices to bear? And then there's a set that is around distribution, which basically boils down to when we get the money should be spent first on communities disadvantaged or otherwise historically disenfranchised, presently disadvantaged. But very little, maybe five total, spoke to structural changes in terms of what are the underlying barriers and causes of the systemic issues that we see on the ground. Should we change tax policy? Should we change zoning? Should we change the municipal boundaries? Should we change the insurance policy? Should we change housing policy and reforms? There was very little that was speaking to that. Rather, by far the greatest majority was, we need to change the process of how we have this conversation. And so I think there is an element here that we're thinking that if people only understood that they need to not be racist or they need to bring other people to bear on this conversation, and the conversation will, we will change the thing. And that is really important because you're not going to get to the structural reform without the process. But I do not yet see significant development. And maybe I want to read the things that Imara has been talking about, but I don't see in the climate world a very clear specification of the kinds of policy reforms that really are needed in order to achieve climate and racial justice in these dimensions. And so at the same time, there's huge sets of very institutional and standard setting conversations that people are having. Should the National Flood Insurance Program continue the way it is? Should we have insurance agencies be able to pull out of a place whenever they feel like they can no longer handle the risk and liabilities of financing development in a particular place? What is the climate justice, and the Black Lives Movement answer to some of those kinds of spaces? So there are these very divergent conversations that are happening in very powerful realms that really are not connecting. So I would like to leave with one final set of comments, which is around the capacity building component and how we might educate and develop that source. And I think that there is an assumption that our communities exist as some kind of cohesive entity. And that is true in certain types of places that have long histories of mobilization. But the more that you have migration and turnover and shifts of movements of people and the introduction of new people, as well as evictions, there is going to be a disruption to those kinds of community or the complete lack of presence of community entities in the first place. So the assumption that there is a community that we can actually engage with or that can advocate, that mobilization needs to be invested in and created. And so there is some recognition of that. And I think that we do see some efforts to engage communities in that, and an effort to bring, for instance, bring more of these kinds of NSF grants. For instance, I'm currently simultaneously on a Zoom call right now for the DOE, the Department of Energy, to fund new climate resilience centers that will bring the science of the DOE to different communities, disadvantaged communities, and the education component is a chief part of it. So we see some of that, but I'm wondering also how much funding we are actually investing in community building as a key part of our infrastructure to do this work. So when we, for instance, in the United States context, we are now spending billions upon billions of dollars with the new spending funds that Biden has approved. Almost all of that funding is for infrastructure, and almost none of it is for actual community building or for institution building at the local and municipal levels. And so over and over again, what you hear people saying is not we don't have enough money, but we don't have enough capacity. And we don't have capacity of the kinds that Joanna, Rebecca, and others are mentioning. We have a lot of engineers who don't know how to talk to people or how to think about social issues or how to engage with equity and justice. And they are the people who are now supposed to take these resiliency dollars and investments and then make them work for disadvantaged communities that they've never really engaged with. That's just a recipe for disaster, and we're not going to actually get the funding to be spent in a way that helps people. So on both ends, there's a capacity building question for the cities as well as for the communities that we actually have to advocate for in order to achieve the kinds of technical changes that we want to see. So I'll leave that. I know that we are at time, and hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Linda. Very thought-provoking questions and comments. We do have 3 minutes left, and I'm sure everyone is eager to get out of here, but I do want to give you all the last word. So maybe 30 seconds on bites, if you all can offer those. Responding to what Linda had to say.
You know what? What I would love to do is just echo what Linda said about community investment. There are many organizations in this city, for instance, and when we've done the research, that have been doing this work on a shoestring and have major contributions to make to resilience-oriented change that's rooted in racial justice, rooted in justice, period. But that requires a huge valuation of those organizations and those activists and those groups in ways that they haven't been valued historically. And so that point around infrastructure versus people really resonates. And it's something that we have to give massive amounts of attention to if we're going to meet the future in the way we need to.
Thanks, Imara.
I guess I would say that our approach is, and I think recognizing that we have a very little space in which we can maneuver in the roles that we have, is trying to develop something that's scalable and that can be used by other people and sort of developed to other contexts. So our focus in this project was really on refining this methodology of using affective pedagogies to try and sort of change will and build compassion in ways that can be replicated in other places, so the model can be adapted. And so it's just sort of our humble attempt to help bridge that gap.
Yeah, at the same time, we've tailored it particularly to the context, and that's part of the methodology, is that often this kind of capacity building, like there's so many tools out there, but they're not always sort of rooted in an analysis of the kind of knowledge needs or capacity needs. But the idea is that we'll put it out there, and then people can kind of take it to, adjust that language or tailor it to the issues that are relevant to the contexts and groups with which they're working.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Capacity building and capability building never get old. On that note, thank you everyone for joining us. Have fun for the rest.
A perfect segue to the discussion we were having here. We're going to have MP for Toronto Danforth and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources and the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Rolston, who I think has just arrived. So meet back here 3:45 for that discussion. Thank you.